The young lifeguard instructor barely glanced up from his clipboard when the old man shuffled toward the pool deck. Red jacket worn at the edges, white beard catching the morning light, that sad, serious expression that seemed carved into his weathered face. The instructor smirked to his assistant. "One lap and you'll need an ambulance, Pops. Maybe you should stick to the shallow end with the kids." The old man said nothing, just set down his towel with hands that trembled slightly, revealing dog tags that clinked softly against his chest. The other rescue certification candidates, all in their 20s and 30s, exchanged knowing looks. This was going to be embarrassing to watch. His name was Thomas Grant, 72 years old, living alone in a small apartment 3 blocks from the community pool. Nobody there knew that 50 years ago those same hands had pulled 17 men from burning water off the coast of Vietnam. Nobody knew about the Navy Cross tucked away in a shoebox, or the commendations for maritime rescue operations that spanned 2 decades of service. Nobody knew because Thomas never spoke of it. He'd returned home to silence and had chosen to keep it. His daughter lived across the country. His wife had passed 6 years back. But something had stirred in him when he saw the flyer for emergency water rescue certification. Something that remembered what it meant to save a life. Something that remembered what it meant to be useful. The instructor's name was Derek Chen, 28, confident in his abilities, proud of his program's reputation for washing out the weak. He ran the most demanding water rescue course in the county. Fire departments sent their candidates here, police departments too. His pass rate hovered around 40%, and he wore that statistic like a badge. He'd seen plenty of people overestimate themselves, plenty of egos deflated in his pool. But an old man in a red jacket with shaking hands? This wasn't overconfidence. This was delusion. Derek almost felt bad about what was going to happen. Almost. The first test was basic. Tread water for 10 minutes while holding a 10-pound weight above the surface. Simple endurance. The young candidates dropped into the pool with practiced efficiency, powerful legs churning, arms steady. Thomas was last to enter, lowering himself carefully down the ladder. His movements looked stiff, uncertain. Derek started his stopwatch and leaned back against the wall, already composing the gentle words he'd used to suggest Thomas pursue a different certification, maybe CPR for seniors, something on dry land. But 3 minutes in, something shifted. The younger candidates were breathing hard, arms beginning to dip, the weight kissing the water surface. Thomas remained perfectly still in the center of the pool, not thrashing, not struggling. His legs moved in small, efficient circles beneath the surface. The weight held rock steady above his head like he'd been born doing this. His face showed no strain, just that same sad, serious expression, white beard dripping, eyes focused on some distant point only he could see. Derek's smirk faded. He checked his stopwatch. 5 minutes. 6. 2 candidates had already failed, gasping at the pool edge. Thomas hadn't moved an inch from his position, hadn't wavered. At 10 minutes, Derek called time. Half the class had washed out on the first test. Thomas set the weight on the pool deck with the same careful precision he'd used entering the water. No heavy breathing, no shaking arms. Derek's assistant whispered, "Did you see that?" The old guy didn't even look tired. Derek said nothing. Coincidence? Maybe the old man had been a swimmer once. Didn't mean anything for the real tests ahead. The second phase was rescue swimming. Retrieve a weighted dummy from the bottom of the deep end, bring it to the surface, and tow it 50 meters to the opposite end of the pool. Speed and technique both mattered. The candidates went one at a time. Good times clustered around 2 minutes. Excellent times broke 90 seconds. Derek's personal record stood at 78 seconds, set when he was 24 and in peak condition. He still held the course record, still reminded people of it regularly. Thomas waited until last again, stood at the edge of the deep end, that red jacket folded neatly on the bench behind him, dog tags visible now against his plain white t-shirt. Derek noticed them for the first time, noticed how worn they were, how the metal had been touched so many times the engraving was nearly smooth. He felt the first small flutter of uncertainty in his chest, but pushed it away. Lots of old guys wore dog tags. Didn't mean they could swim. The whistle blew. Thomas dove. Not the cautious entry Derek expected, but a clean racing dive that barely disturbed the water. He knifed down toward the dummy 12 feet below with a speed that made the assistant check the stopwatch, certain it had malfunctioned. Thomas surfaced with the dummy in a textbook cross-chest carry, already moving, legs driving in a powerful scissor kick that sent him gliding across the pool surface like he weighed nothing. The younger candidates who'd gone before him had struggled, fought the water, muscled their way across. Thomas moved like he was part of it, like the water was helping him instead of resisting. He touched the far wall and Derek's assistant stared at the stopwatch. 61 seconds. Derek grabbed it from her hand, certain she'd misread. The numbers didn't change. 61 seconds, 17 seconds faster than his own record, set by a 72-year-old man in a worn t-shirt. The pool deck went silent. Every candidate was staring. Thomas pulled himself out of the water, breathing slightly harder now but still composed, still wearing that expression of quiet sadness that never seemed to shift. Derek's mind raced. Fluke. Had to be. The real test was coming. The scenario simulation. Full rescue under stress conditions. That's where technique broke down, where panic set in, where age and trembling hands would finally matter. They set up the scenario, drowning victim, unconscious, in rough water conditions created by wave machines at full power. The rescuer had to swim out, assess, secure, and bring the victim back while being battered by artificial surf. They had to maintain an airway, had to keep themselves and the victim safe. Most candidates took 3 or 4 attempts to pass. Some never did. Derek had seen grown men cry during this test, had seen police officers quit. He watched Thomas standing at the ready position and felt a strange mixture of anticipation and something else, something that might have been dread. The whistle sounded. The wave machines roared to life. Thomas entered the churning water and disappeared into the foam. Derek lost sight of him for a moment, then spotted him cutting through the chaos like it wasn't there, like the waves were just suggestions he chose to ignore. He reached the dummy, performed the assessment with practiced hands, secured the airway hold, and began the return journey. The waves that had thrown other candidates off course, that had forced them to restart, to struggle, seemed to barely touch him. He rode them, used them, arrived at the pool edge with the dummy secure, airway maintained, in less time than anyone Derek had ever certified. The assistant was no longer hiding her shock. She looked at Derek with wide eyes. "Who is this guy?" Derek didn't answer because he didn't know, didn't want to know, wanted this to be over so he could process what he was seeing. They moved to the final test, team rescue. 2 candidates working together to save multiple victims in a mass casualty scenario. Thomas was paired with Jake, a fire department candidate half his age and twice his size. Jake had been one of the top performers all morning. He looked at Thomas with new respect now, with something approaching awe. The scenario began. 3 dummies in the water, wave machines running, a 4-minute time limit. Jake and Thomas moved in perfect synchronization, no discussion, no planning. Thomas simply nodded once and they entered the water like they'd been training together for years. Jake grabbed the first victim, looked back to see Thomas already securing the second, already moving towards the third. They worked with an efficiency that made the scenario look easy, made 4 minutes seem like an eternity. They finished in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Derek had never seen the drill completed that fast, never imagined it possible. As Thomas climbed out for the final time, Derek noticed his hands weren't shaking anymore. Noticed how he moved with a certainty that had been hidden under that shuffling entrance. Noticed the dog tags catching the light. Derek's grandfather had been Navy. He recognized the style, the era, Vietnam-era tags. He felt his throat tighten, felt the question forming that he should have asked hours ago. The class was over. Derek called everyone to the briefing area for final scores and certifications. He went through each candidate methodically, offering feedback, pointing out weaknesses, praising strengths. When he reached Thomas, he paused. The words he'd prepared about gentle letdowns and alternative certifications seemed to belong to a different day, a different old man. He looked at Thomas's score sheet. Perfect marks in every category. Record-breaking times in 2 events. He looked up at the sad, serious face, the white beard, the red jacket back in place now, and finally asked the question. "Sir, what's your background? Where did you learn to swim like that?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, voice soft but steady. Navy. Long time ago. I was a rescue swimmer, before it was called that officially. Before they had the programs they have now. We just did what needed doing. Pulled pilots from the water, pulled sailors from burning ships. Did it for 23 years before my knees gave out and they put me behind a desk. He touched the dog tags through his shirt. Lost some good men teaching me how. Figured I owed it to them to remember. Derek felt something crack in his chest. Felt the weight of his own arrogance settling like a stone. He thought about that first comment. 1 lap and you'll need an ambulance, Pops. Thought about how close he'd come to turning this man away before he'd even entered the water. He stood up. The whole class was listening now. Derek's voice was rough when he spoke. Sir, I owe you an apology. I judged you before you ever got wet. That was wrong, unprofessional, disrespectful. You've not only passed this certification, you've set records that I don't think will be broken. You've shown everyone here what real skill looks like, what real experience means. Thomas nodded slowly. Didn't smile, just that same sad expression. Appreciate that, but you don't owe me anything. You run a good program. Tough standards. That's how it should be. Keeps people alive. He looked around at the younger candidates. All of you did well. Keep training, keep learning. The water doesn't care how confident you are, doesn't care about your age or your strength. It only cares if you know what you're doing. Respect it and it'll work with you. Fight it and you'll lose every time. Jake, the fire department candidate, stepped forward. Sir, where did you serve? What unit? Thomas named a ship that had been decommissioned 40 years ago. Named operations that Jake had only read about in history books. Named places where American sailors had died and been saved in equal measure. The room had gone completely silent. Derek's assistant was crying quietly. Another candidate, a police officer named Martinez, stood at attention without even realizing he was doing it. Derek made a decision. He pulled out his phone, made a call. His supervisor, a retired Coast Guard commander, answered on the second ring. Derek explained the situation, explained who was standing in his pool facility, explained what he'd just witnessed. There was a long pause on the other end, then, put him on. Derek handed Thomas the phone, watched the old man's face as he listened. Watched something shift in those sad eyes. Not quite happiness, but recognition. Connection. The voice of someone who understood. The conversation was brief. Thomas handed back the phone. Derek's supervisor's voice was thick. That man is a legend. We studied his rescues at the academy. The Coral Sea fire in 71. He went into burning water 6 times, saved 17 men. 17. They wanted to give him the Medal of Honor, but he refused it. Said he was just doing his job. Said the real heroes didn't come home. Derek, you just certified a genuine American hero. Treat him accordingly. Derek ended the call with shaking hands. Looked at Thomas standing there in his worn red jacket, white beard dripping pool water, that expression of quiet sadness that made sense now. Made terrible, beautiful sense. He wasn't sad because he was weak or lost or diminished by age. He was sad because he remembered, because he carried the weight of those who didn't make it, because 17 men lived but others hadn't, because being a hero meant living with what you'd seen. The certifications were handed out. When Derek reached Thomas, he didn't just hand over the certificate. He stood. The whole class stood with him. Derek saluted. It was imperfect, civilian, probably technically wrong, but it came from somewhere real. Thomas returned it with the precision of a man who'd done it 10,000 times, who'd saluted fallen friends and rising suns and flags at half-mast. Then he shook Derek's hand, shook every candidate's hand, told each of them to stay safe, to train hard, to remember that saving lives was a privilege and a responsibility. As Thomas gathered his things to leave, Jake approached him. Sir, would you be willing to come back? Help us train? We could learn so much from you. Thomas considered this. Looked around the pool that had probably seemed like just another community recreation center when he'd walked in that morning. Looked at the young faces watching him with new eyes, with respect earned rather than assumed. Finally, he nodded. I could do that. Once a week maybe, if it helps. Derek walked Thomas to the door. The old man moved with that same careful shuffle, but Derek saw it differently now. Saw the worn knees that had given out after 23 years of diving into chaos. Saw the trembling hands that had held onto drowning men in burning water until help arrived. saw the red jacket as armor against a world that had mostly forgotten what he'd done, what he'd given. At the door, Derek spoke quietly. "Thank you, sir, for your service, for showing me what I needed to see, for not giving up when I was an arrogant fool." Thomas looked at him with those sad, serious eyes. "You weren't a fool. You were protecting your standards. That's good. Just remember that people carry things you can't see, experiences that don't show on the surface. The strongest swimmers aren't always the youngest or the loudest. Sometimes they're the quiet ones who've already survived the worst water you can imagine." He left. Derek watched through the window as the old man in the red jacket walked slowly down the sidewalk, white hair bright in the afternoon sun, dog tags hidden again beneath his shirt. Behind him, the class was buzzing with energy. Martinez was already looking up the Coral Sea fire on his phone, reading the reports with wide eyes. Jake was recalculating his own training regimen, humbled and inspired in equal measure. The assistant was updating the record board, adding Thomas Grant's name in permanent marker at the top of multiple categories. Derek sat down heavily on the bench, thought about all the people he might have turned away over the years, all the judgments made from appearances, all the potential he might have missed because someone didn't look the part. He thought about the lesson Thomas had taught without meaning to. That respect isn't given for what people look like. It's earned by what they do, what they've done, what they carry silently inside them. The next week, Thomas returned, wore the same red jacket, same sad expression, same careful shuffle to the pool deck. But this time, when he arrived, the entire class stood. Derek had told them more of the story, had shown them the records, had explained what it meant to be a rescue swimmer before the programs existed, before the glory and the movies and the recognition, when it was just men going into hell because someone needed saving. Thomas taught them things that day that weren't in any manual, taught them how to read water like a language, how to conserve energy in chaos, how to stay calm when everything screamed at you to panic, taught them by showing, by doing, by being living proof that skill and courage and experience mattered more than age or appearance or first impressions. Months later, Jake used Thomas's techniques to save a child from a flooded drainage channel. Martinez pulled an elderly woman from a submerged vehicle using the exact positioning Thomas had demonstrated. Derek's program gained a reputation not just for being tough, but for producing rescuers who actually saved lives. And every certification class began the same way now, with Derek telling the story of the old man in the red jacket who'd been dismissed with a cruel joke and had responded by breaking every record in the book, by being exactly who he'd always been, a quiet hero who'd never stopped knowing his purpose. Thomas still came every week, still wore that expression of sadness that was really remembrance, still moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned that every motion could mean the difference between life and death. And every week, young rescuers learned that the most important lesson wasn't about swimming or techniques or certifications. It was about respect, about recognizing that everyone carries a story, that the person you dismiss might be the one who has the most to teach. That true strength often comes wrapped in humble packages, wearing worn red jackets, carrying invisible weights that never fully lift but can be shared, can be honored, can be remembered by those willing to look beyond the surface and see what really matters underneath.